Welcome, and thank you for joining Snow Owl Libraries for Botany of the Pacific Northwest. First, I would like to share a few housekeeping notes. Your mics are muted. You may use chat to ask questions. We will collect the questions to share with the presenter for a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We will use chat on our end to share links to any lists and websites mentioned today. Look for them at the end of the program. The event is being recorded and will be available on Snow Owl Library's YouTube channel with captions in a few days. Today you are joining us to hear about the botany of the Pacific Northwest. Whether your goal is to sustainably harvest edible plants, build pollinator-friendly gardens, or simply explore your local ecology, learning basic plant identification is just the place to start. Our presenter today, botanist Nolan Exie, received his Bachelor's of Science degree from Western Washington University. Nolan has spent the last 5 years working as a field botanist in the Pacific Northwest, as well as South America and Southeast Asia. Let's all welcome Nolan as he shares his knowledge about local flora and our role in preserving it.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Marina. I'm so excited to be here today to talk about my favorite subject in my favorite place, the Pacific Northwest. So I'm a field botanist, and more specifically, I'm a biogeographer, which means that I study what lives where, which is no easy task considering that there are almost 400,000 known plant species on the planet, with more being discovered all the time. And I've traveled through deserts, swamps, jungles, and mountains, documenting the plants that live there. But I've never been anywhere that I love quite as much as the Pacific Northwest. Now, you might love the Pacific Northwest already, but I guarantee that the more time you spend looking closely at the astounding biodiversity here, the deeper your appreciation will grow. So here are just a few of the creatures that live in the Pacific Northwest, along with their scientific names. And I think that when you're able to put a name to something that you see out in nature, that's really the first step in understanding how it fits into the bigger picture and uncovering the connections between life and the landscape. So my goal today is to share with you a little bit about what I know about plant identification, and also show you just how easy it is for anybody to contribute to our understanding of life on this planet. And we can't make it too much further without talking about the differences between scientific names and common names. For this presentation, I'm going to be using scientific names because, in general, they're a lot more reliable and a lot more descriptive. Scientific names are created based on the similarities between plants. So, for example, groups of similar families are placed together in families. This plant is in the family Orobanchaceae. And then within each family, even more similar plants are grouped together into genre. So this plant is in the genus, which is the singular of genre, Pedicularis. And then each unique plant is given a two-part or binomial name that starts with the genus and then has a unique specific epithet. So for this plant, it's Pedicularis groenlandica. And already that tells us a little bit about this plant, because we know that it's related to all other Pedicularises, and the name Groenlandica means that it was first described in Greenland, which is pretty useful to know. And when you compare that to common names, they can be all over the place. So one plant might have multiple common names, or two totally different plants might have the same common name. And sometimes the common names are pretty good, like elephant's head for this flower is perfectly fitting. Other times, not so much. So throughout history, this plant has been believed both to cause head lice and cure head lice, earning it the name lousewort. Neither claim has ever been backed up by any evidence. So I'll stick to the scientific names for this presentation. All right, so where exactly is the Pacific Northwest, and what makes this place so special? Well, botanically speaking, we live in the Vancouvernian Floristic Province, which is this narrow strip of land shown here in purple. And it runs from roughly Kodiak Island, Alaska, down into the southern Sierra Nevadas in California. And what this map is showing us is that the plants here in Western Washington are actually more similar overall to the plants in Western Alaska and Southern California than they are to the plants in Eastern Washington. Although I should point out that the Vancouvernian Floristic Province and the Rocky Mountain Floristic Province, shown here in blue, are more similar to each other than they are to any of the others. So for this presentation, I'll mostly be focusing on the plants of Western Washington in the Vancouvernian Floristic Province, but I did put a few in from Eastern Washington as well. So there's a wide range of habitats here in the Vancouvernian province, but by far our defining habitat is temperate rainforest. And the Pacific temperate rainforest is actually the largest temperate rainforest in the entire world. It's remarkable for its high conifer diversity, conifers being trees like firs and pines and other evergreens. We have more species of conifer here than anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere, and more species of conifer than any other temperate region on the planet. And a lot of our conifers reach incredible record-breaking sizes too. Epiphytes, like mosses and ferns, grow from every available surface, hanging down from the canopy. And evergreen shrubs and ferns make up the understory. And with the high rainfall and cool temperatures here, our rainforests have almost an impossibly green look year-round. And so North America as a whole actually only has 4 endemic plant families, meaning families of plants that aren't found anywhere else in the world. This is mostly because of the asteroid that wiped all of the life off of this continent, including the dinosaurs, 65 million years ago. And as a result, the Vancouvernian Floristic Province has no endemic plant families, but it does have a few endemic plant genera, like the carnivorous Darlingtonias of California and Sequoia sempervirens, the coastal redwood, one of those record-breaking conifers that I was talking about. Vancouveria hexandra is one of my favorites that ranges from California up into southern Washington. And Tolmia menziesii and Omlaria cerasiformis are 2 of the most common plants here in our lowland western Washington forests. But these genuses or genera can't be found anywhere else in the world, making this area unique. Okay, so for the next part of the presentation, I just want to go through some of the most common plant families that are found in the Pacific Northwest, especially in Western Washington. But before I can do that, I just want to go over this simplified floral diagram to show you a few of the parts that are really useful for telling different plant families apart. Of course, I'll be talking a lot about the petals, shown here in pink, and the sepals, which are usually right behind the petals in green. Also be talking about the male pollen-producing parts of the flower, known as stamens. So the stamen is broken up into the anther, which is this sort of hot dog bun-shaped piece here, where the pollen is produced, and this long, skinny filament. And then the female parts of the flower called the carpels, which are found in the middle of the flower. There can be one or many. And they're broken up into the stigma, which receives the pollen, the style, which transports the pollen down to the ovary, where the seeds can become fertilized. And in many plants, this will eventually develop into a fruit. So those are the important parts that are really helpful for telling different plant families apart. So just going by the numbers, the Asteraceae, or the sunflower family, is the most diverse family in all of Washington state. There's 457 species found in Washington state. And this is actually arguably the most diverse plant family in the whole world, although the votes are not all counted yet. It could also be the Orchidaceae, as many new Orchidaceae are discovered in the tropics all the time, or the orchid family. And because there's so many species of Asteraceae, they're highly variable, especially in growth habit. They can be anything from tiny little herbs or annual flowers to larger shrubs or trees and vines in some parts of the world. But what you really want to look for to recognize this family is the composite flowers. And what I mean by that is that what might look like one flower, like on a sunflower or a daisy, is actually made up of a bunch of really tiny flowers when you look closely, which you can see really well on this Chenactis douglasii, a species found in eastern and southern Washington, as well as elsewhere. And so you can see that each of these little white flowers, white petaled flowers, has a purple carpel that comes out and splits into two stigma, the pollen receiving areas. And so some members of this family, they only have these radially symmetrical disc flowers like this Chenactis, whereas others have highly modified flowers on the edge of the disc that give it the appearance of having these larger petals. So each one of these petals on the edge of this Erigeron compositus here is actually coming out of one individual flower, giving it the appearance of one much larger flower. Another key feature to look for with this family is the involucral bracts, which are these green parts here. And I know I just said the sepals are found behind the petals usually, but in this case, they're hidden by these bracts. And these are very distinctive for telling different species apart within this family. All right, and so the second most speciose family in Washington state is the Poaceae, or the grass family. And it's usually really easy to tell that something is a grass, but often very, very difficult to tell exactly what genus or species it might be. So I won't go too in depth with the grasses, but I do want to point out that grasses are flowering plants and they have all of the normal parts of a flower, although they're highly modified and highly reduced. So you can see on this Bromus inermis here, the yellow anthers sticking out. And then this feathery white part here is the stigma. And then the petals and sepals have been highly modified into these bracts. And this plant is actually pretty highly invasive in our area. But this one, Glyceria grandis, is one of my favorites because of the color, and it grows in, it's a sign of healthy wetland habitats here in Washington. And then Poemacrantha is a species that's entirely endemic to the Vancouverian floristic province, found in sandy soils along the coast. And then the third most common plant family in Washington state is the Fabaceae, or the pea family, with 217 species. And if you're a gardener at all, and you've ever grown snap peas or beans, you should have no trouble at all recognizing this family in the wild, because they always have these papilionaceous flowers, which means butterfly shaped, more or less. but they're distinct because they have one petal called a banner petal, which sticks up above the rest, two petals that stick out to either side called the wing petals, and then a keel petal, which is hidden in this picture, but it's in between the wings. And the keel petal is folded up, enclosing the stamens and the carpels. And then peas, of course, also have pods. And this species is actually not native to the Pacific Northwest. It's native to the American Southwest, but I just could not resist throwing it in here because it has the coolest pods, I think, of any wild Fabaceae species that I've ever seen. It's called the painted milk vetch, or Astragalus ceramicus. Clovers are also in this family, which are in the genus Trifolium. And so the compound leaves, like that of a clover, are very distinctive of this family, or like those of a lupine. And a compound leaf is when one leaf splits apart into multiple smaller leaflets. And so clovers are one variation on this, lupines are another. And then many peas also have what's called a pinnate compound leaf, where the leaflets stick out from side to side. All right, and our next family is the Cyperaceae, or the sedge family, with 209 species found in Washington State. It's very similar to the grasses, and one of the easiest ways to tell them apart is that sedges have edges, which you may have heard that before, that slogan. And the way you can feel that is if you just take the stem and you roll it back and forth in your fingers, you'll notice that sedges have a triangular shaped stem and grasses have a round stem. So just like grasses, the flowers are highly modified and reduced. You can see the anthers on this Rhynchospora alba and stigmas sticking out of this carex here. And another main difference between the grasses and the sedges is that sedges have what are known as perigynia, which are these sort of inflated pods here in green that enclose the female parts of the flower. And sedges also have they tend to have a preference for wet habitats, but not always. Alrighty, so the fifth most common family in Washington State is the Brassicaceae family, or the mustard family, with 181 species. And this family is really easy to recognize. They always have 4 petals and what's known as didynamous stamens. I'm sorry I don't have a better picture of this, but if you were to look really closely at this flower, you would see that there's 6 stamens in there, 4 of which are much longer than the other 2. And so that's very distinctive of this family. And mustards also have pods that can either have siliques, which are these long, skinny, sort of sleek seed pods, or silicles, which are these shorter, rounder seed pods. All right, something really cool about the mustard family is that if you can get one up close under a microscope or a hand lens, you can see that they often have these really, really beautiful, intricate branching hairs, which you can sort of see on the tip of this leaf here, how the hair comes off and then splits multiple times. And the branching pattern can actually be really distinctive of which species of mustard you're looking at. All right, so the families I just showed you were the top 5 in Washington State in terms of the number of species in the family. But now I'm just going to show you other families that are commonly found here, not necessarily the top ranking in terms of species diversity. Starting with the rose family, or the Rosaceae. And there's 167 species, so still quite a lot. Things to look for with this family are the presence of a hypanthium, which is a rounded cup shape or sort of a enlarged area at the base of the sepals, which you can see at the base of this Rubus spectabilis flower here. Oftentimes they also have these serrated or toothed leaf margins. And they always have very many stamens, which you can see on the Stachyphora fruticosa and also on this Physocarpus capitatus. And so none of these features are really unique to this family, but when you see all these features in combination, it's pretty likely that you're looking at a member of the rose family. And a lot of times they also have thorns, but not always. And they produce edible berries or other edible fruits. And if you've ever been berry picking in the Pacific Northwest, probably a lot of the berries you were picking were in this family, like these wild raspberries here, or these are salmon berries up here, Rubus spectabilis, or thimbleberries, or even the invasive Himalayan blackberries. And many of the other for edible fruits that we eat, like apples and pears and plums and peaches and apricots, are all in this family. And as far as I know, there's no poisonous rosaceae anywhere in the world. Not that doesn't necessarily mean they all taste good, but I think there's none that have developed any toxins anywhere that I know of. But that doesn't mean you should just go off eating them, of course. If you're ever going to be harvesting plants in the wild, you need to be really sure of two things. Number one, you need to be 100% sure of the identification of that plant, because we do have a lot of very poisonous plants here in the Pacific Northwest. And number two, you want to make sure that you're harvesting in a sustainable way. It's very easy to accidentally damage or kill a lot of plants if you're not careful when you're harvesting. You want to make sure that you're on land where it's legal and ethical to harvest. And you just want to make sure not to harvest some species, because so many of our native species are declining in their population numbers, and overharvesting is a big contributor to a lot of that. So moving on to the Orchidaceae, or the orchid family. This is one of my all-time favorite families. As I mentioned, they're the top competitor with the Asteraceae for total number of species around the world. But in our area, we only have 43 species. Although it would be quite the adventure to go see them all, because a lot of them are really rare and endemic to really localized areas. So it's pretty easy to recognize orchids. They don't really look like a lot of other plants. They're not usually very leafy. They don't, at least our orchids here, they're not usually very leafy, and they don't have big branching stems. Instead, what you'll see with our orchids is usually just a single stalk that comes out of the ground with these big fleshy flowers that are always bilaterally symmetric, meaning there's only one plane of symmetry right down the middle, as opposed to the radially symmetric flowers of, say, sunflowers or many others. And then the floral parts are highly modified. So the stamen have all been fused together into this pollen tube, which is the yellow part here, and also here. And then the female parts are tucked away deeper in the flower. And so the reason why there's so many orchids on the planet is because they've evolved such an incredible diversity of life strategies. So for example, this orchid, Calypso bulbosa, has a flower that hinges open in such a way that it can only be pollinated by queen bumblebees and no other pollinators. And so these queen bumblebees only come out for a short time in the spring before they found their nests. And they land on the lip here, searching this flower for the sugary nectar that is the reward that most flowers use to lure pollinators in. But they don't find any in these Calypso orchids. Instead, they just get bonked on the head by the pollen tube, leaving pollen in their fuzzy little bumblebee hairs. And the queen bees are smart enough that they'll only try this on 1 or 2 more Calypso orchids before they figure out that it's all been a trick and that there's no nectar produced at all by these plants. But apparently this is enough for the Calypso orchids to complete their life cycle each spring. And this information isn't passed on to the next generation of queen bumblebees. This orchid, Corallarhiza striata, also takes an interesting strategy. It doesn't have any green parts on it, no leaves, doesn't even have roots. And that's because it's entirely parasitic on the fungi in the soil around it. And it doesn't rely on photosynthesis at all. So it doesn't make any of its food from the sunlight like most plants. And interestingly, this orchid is pollinated by another parasite, a parasitic wasp that parasitizes other insects. This orchid, Platanthera elongata, is very interesting. For one, because a lot of our 43 species here actually have really tiny, inconspicuous green flowers like this one, and they're easy to overlook. And then this one's also a bit of a mystery to me because most orchids in the genus Platanthera have these short little short little nectar spurs behind the flower. They actually produce nectar, unlike the Calypsos. But they have these short little nectar spurs, and they're pollinated by short-tongued insects. And I haven't been able to find any scientific literature so far on what insects have a tongue that's long enough to reach the end of these elongated nectar tubes, nectar spurs, and actually reach the sugary nectar back there. So they're a fascinating mystery to me. All right, so the next family I want to talk about is the Ericaceae, or the blueberry family. And this family is really wildly diverse in our area and contains some of our most iconic species here in Washington. Like, of course, our state wildflower, Rhododendron macrophyllum, Arbutus menziesii. These are the close-up of the flowers of the madrona tree. And then a lot of our wild berries, like our mountain blueberries and huckleberries. Also this wild cranberry that grows in bogs in Washington state. And I had a really hard time thinking of like easy tips for recognizing that a plant is in this family. But some things to look for are these, the presence of these sort of urn-shaped flowers, like on the arbutus here. But of course, they don't all have that. Then the presence of these nice juicy berries, but again, not all species have that. And then some of the species are really wild and different from the rest of the family, like this Monotropa uniflora, also called the ghost pipe. And this one is entirely parasitic, just like that orchid I just talked about. But this is one of my favorite families. I think some of our coolest, most iconic plants in the Pacific Northwest are in this family. All right, so next up is the Liliaceae and the Melanthiaceae families, which I included together because they're pretty closely related. And up until fairly recently, they were included in the same family together. And they're pretty easy to recognize because they're some of our showiest wildflowers here in the Pacific Northwest. And also they always have all their floral parts in multiples of 3s. So like on this trillium, you can see there's 3 green sepals and then 3 white petals and 6 stamen. You can see on this fritillary here, there's 6 tepals. And so what tepals are sepals, the green ones, that have been modified to look more like petals. So 3 of these are actually sepals that look like petals, and then 3 are the petals. And so this one right here, Fritillaria aphanis and Calochortus lyalii, these are both in the lily family now. And then Trillium ovadum and Toxicoscordion venenosum are both in the Melanthiaceae family. And this one, Toxicoscordion, is a really interesting species because this is one of the most poisonous plants in our area, also known as death camas. All right, and another really important family here is the Apiaceae, or the carrot family, with 92 species in Washington. This family is pretty easy to recognize. You can use your sense of smell because a lot of times if you crush up a little bit of the leaves, they're really, really aromatic. And it's usually a pretty good smell, like carrots or parsley or a nice spicy herby smell. And they also have these pretty unique floral arrangements called umbels. And so on this species, the flowers are these white parts found at the tips here. And the flowers all branch off from a common point right here. And then those all branch off from a common point right here. So that double branching pattern is called an umbel. And they usually have these highly dissected leaves that can have this feathery look, and they can be bi or tripinnate, meaning they branch off the main stem maybe 1, 2, or 3 times even. And a lot of these species in this family are edible too, like the lomatiums. But this is when you have to be really careful about harvesting because a lot of them have lost a lot of their original habitats. There's not very many left. But you also need to be really careful to, this is a good family for illustrating both those principles I talked about, because also some of the most poisonous plants in Washington state are in this family, like poison hemlock and poison water hemlock. All right. So all those families I just talked about were all flowering plants, which is a big, huge group of plants, all grouped together for their similarities. And then the Pacific Northwest is also very interesting because we have some really high diversities of other groups of plants other than flowering plants, like pteridophytes or ferns, which are a much older group of plants. They evolved 360 million years ago, long before the flowering plants ever evolved. Although the flowering plants are far more successful today, both in terms of abundance and number of species diversity. And so I was kind of amazed to find out the other day that there's actually 118 species of ferns in Washington state, and I thought it was far fewer than that. So I thought that was really cool. And because it's such an old lineage of plants, they're incredibly diverse. Even though they might all look fairly similar, like ferns, there's a ton of different families of ferns that are actually genetically pretty distantly related to each other. But of course, ferns are pretty easy to recognize, but they usually have pinnate leaves where the leaflets come off the main stem or some variation on this. And rather than having fruits and flowers, like all of the plant families I've talked about up to this point, they're spore bearing. And you can usually, depending on the season, find the spores underneath each of the leaflets. They'll look like little orange or black or brown dots covered in the dusty spores. And then another group, which is really iconic in the Pacific Northwest, is the gymnosperms, or the conifers, with 33 species here, which, as I mentioned earlier, is actually quite a lot compared to most parts of the world. And there's 3 families. There's the pine family, the cypress family, and then the yew family here. And so these, again, they're they're more recently evolved than the ferns, but not as recent as the flowering plants that we've been looking at. And so they don't have fruits or flowers, and instead they produce cones. Most of them are evergreen with leaves modified into tiny needles. This Larix lyalii here, and we have another species, Larix occidentalis. Those are the larches, and they're both really interesting species because they're the only deciduous conifers in our area, meaning they drop their needles each year. And if you go up in Eastern Washington, in places in Eastern Washington, high in the Cascades, during the fall, you can see some really amazing, spectacular fall colors on the larch species up there. All right, so that's all the plant families that I am going to talk about here and now. Of course, I just barely scratched the surface of the plant families that are out there. So if you really want to learn more, I highly recommend starting with a plant field guide. These books are great because a lot of times they have really good pictures and really good information. This one right here, Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast, is my favorite field guide because it has so much information on ecology and ethnobotany. But of course, these guides are great as well. If you're feeling a little more adventurous, you might want to try to tackle some of those harder groups of plants. Now that you know that they're two of the most common plants in Washington State, the sedges and the grasses. These books are both fantastic, both for beginners and experts. I cannot stress how much easier they make it to start identifying plants like sedges and grasses. But of course, no field guide is ever going to contain all of the plants in the Pacific Northwest. So eventually you're going to have to turn to the flora of the Pacific Northwest. And this book really, I wish I had a sideways photo to show you how thick this book is, because it contains all of the plants in the entire Pacific Northwest and then some. So this book covers the Vancouverian floristic province as well as huge parts of the Rocky Mountain province. And this book is pretty dense. You won't find any nice pictures or fun facts in here, but you will find fun words like zygomorphic and stoloniferous, and you'll find botanical keys that ask you a series of questions to help you narrow in your identification of the plant you're looking at. And this really is the essential guide for all of the plants in our region. But I highly recommend bringing this book with you if you're going to tackle the flora, because this book has really good illustrations of all of the complicated and sometimes obscure terminology in the flora. And now I get to talk about my favorite website of all time, which is called iNaturalist. Many of you might already be familiar with it. And what I think makes this website so cool is that anybody can upload any photos of any organism, not just plants, and then the community will help identify it. And so that's what all of these red dots are representing, is observations that people have uploaded. And the more observations, the darker red it is. So you can see most are from North America and Europe. There's over 67 million observations that have been uploaded so far by people from all around the world, both amateurs and experts alike. And then if we, let's see, if we narrow our search a little further in on the plants, specifically, we can see that there's 27 million observations of 117,000 species of plants. And so that's, if you remember, that's just over 25% of the total known plant species in the world. So even though there's a huge amount of observations on here already, there's still a lot of plants that have, and other species that have yet to be documented. And there's many plant species out there that don't have a single photograph taken of them ever. And if we zoom in a little further on the plants of Washington State, we can see most of the observations are up and down the I-5 corridor here. And if we look even closer, say at the North Cascades National Park, you can see there's still some pretty big gaps where no one has documented anything yet on iNaturalist. There's other databases that collect this kind of information, but this is certainly one of the biggest. And what's the key feature here is that every one of these observations has to be uploaded with the coordinates where it was observed, making it useful to biogeographers like me. And so at the same time that you're learning about your local biodiversity, you're contributing to this massive biogeographical database, which is really important information. And there's not enough scientists and not enough funding to get everybody out on the ground looking at species all over. And so having the help of citizen scientists is so amazing. The amount of data generated is really impressive. And that's really important right now because the world is changing faster than any time throughout human history. And from a biodiversity perspective, a lot of those aren't good changes. So there's clear evidence that many species are already moving in response to climate change, moving north or to higher elevations to flee from deadly temperatures. A lot of that data was collected right here on iNaturalist too. And then an even bigger threat to many species is habitat loss, just the clearing of habitat for parking lots and housing developments and the draining of wetlands. I participated in a study a few years ago to search for 900 plant species across Washington and Oregon and look for their historical records. And what the study team found was that 79% of the species had at least one historical record, so 50 years or older, that could not be relocated, which could mean that that population is lost. And well, some of those might turn up, many will not, meaning that those species are declining overall. In the words of my personal botany mentor, Dr. Eric Duchesne of Western Washington University, the decline of nature befalls unnoticed until the baseline of what was natural is forgotten. It passes into the realm of myth and legend. Subsequent generations create new definitions of natural based on the environmental conditions in which they grow up. And through this process, the standards for acceptable environmental conditions erode away. But by recording your local biodiversity on iNaturalist, you are creating that baseline that future generations may always refer back to. And the more awareness people have of the biodiversity around us, the more likely it is that those future generations will look back at this baseline and be able to say, look how many species we saved, instead of look how many species we lost. All right, so that's all I have for today. Here are the references for the two figures that I used. And if you're interested in more photos and fun facts, check out my Instagram. You can also follow me on iNaturalist or on YouTube for some guided plant walks. And with that, I'm ready for questions.
Great, thank you, Nolan. Let me get to the questions here. So the first question is, how does variety fit into plant nomenclature?
Yeah, so I just talked about families, genre, and species, but there's larger groupings to organize plants and also smaller groupings. So even within species, you can have different varieties. And the reason why it's really important to keep track of those varieties is even if they might not really look different to the casual observer, there can actually be hidden genetic diversity within a species. And some varieties might have different traits that other parts of the population might not. And those traits could turn out to be, from a conservation perspective, those traits could turn out to be really important for dealing with changing climates or changing habitats. So that's why I think it's important to keep track of varieties.
The next question, I think you answered later in your presentation, but conifers have needles as opposed to leaves, correct?
That's in our region, that is correct, yes. In the tropics, you'll find a lot of broadleaf conifers, which is really interesting, but I don't think there's any broadleaf conifers anywhere in the Pacific Northwest.
Next question, are epiphytes good for other plants?
Oh, epiphytes. They can be something that's they can be, or they can be parasitic. Something that I learned that's really interesting is that the moss that's growing as an epiphyte on a lot of the big leaf maple trees on the Olympic Peninsula, which those hold so many epiphytes, and a lot of that moss up in the canopy, it retains so much moisture that maple tree can grow roots out of its trunk or out of its branches into the moss and absorb some of that moisture. So that's an example of an epiphyte being really helpful, but they can also be parasites too.
Next, we have someone who has a comment. I found a cactus on a west-facing bluff on Whidbey Island. Do we have cacti here, or was it somehow introduced by birds or people? Thank you.
I grew up on Whidbey Island, and I've seen those cacti, and both of those hypotheses are correct. We do have native cactus here. The tiny, low-growing cactus on that bluff is Opuntia fragilis, the most widespread cactus species in the whole world. And then the larger cactus there, the one that is, like probably like 6 feet tall, that's actually Opuntia engelmannii, and no one really knows how that got there. It's native to like Texas and the Southwest. I don't know how it got there.
Are thorns in other family than the Rosaceae?
Yeah, so thorns are a really common defense that many totally unrelated groups of plants have developed. The Rosaceae is a tricky family because there's not really one distinctive thing you can look for to ID that family. You just got to look at the whole combination of characteristics, I think.
Someone has a comment in relation to the orchid, where they said bats have a long tongue to reach some nectar.
Mm-hmm.
So
bats pollinate a lot of different plants. That's definitely a possibility.
And then, do you know whether the Indian pipe plant in the Kettles area on Whidbey Island is part of the orchid or blueberry family? They've seen white ones, ghost pipe, which is what they think you showed, and some with stripes. And that's, thank you, and it's from Leslie.
Yeah, so the sort of ghostly white one, that's definitely in the Ericaceae family, the blueberry family. And there's one other pink species of that. And there might be a few other parasitic Ericaceae that you would see out there. So there's a few species in the blueberry family and also some stripy orchids that you might be seeing as well, that both share that parasitic trait.
So someone has a question. You talk related to the number of species in Washington, but which actually is the most common, the most prevalent? I'm assuming in the world? I don't know.
Okay. That's a tough question to answer. I think probably, I'm just guessing here. I think the most common species in the world would probably be some species of grass. maybe like Poa pratensis. But I'm totally guessing there. Yeah, I don't know. That's really interesting.
All right. Someone wants to know, is there a specific book you would start with for someone interested in turning this into a career?
Sorry, could you repeat that one?
Is there a specific book you would start with for someone interested in turning this into a career, like another guide?
Oh, really, I always recommend just starting with field guides, and then when you find a plant you don't recognize in there, that's when you can move on to the flora, or iNaturalist, or some combination of those three. In terms of turning it into a career, I don't know. I'm still working on that too.
And in relation to books, you mentioned the size of the flora of the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
One of the co-hosts actually has a copy of it, and she wanted to, she said she could share how big it was if everyone was interested in seeing that, so she could turn her video on.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, so this is my textbook from botany class. It's a good chunk. And it's basically a flow chart, but in book form. So it's kind of cool. It has some pictures, but it's all black and white. But, yeah.
And we do have that book in our catalog, so you can find it.
And that's the older version. That's the smaller version too.
Yes. Yeah, we do have several copies just in reference as well. So there are some that live in the branches.
And then, the question about the most common prevalent species was actually specifically for Washington. So I don't know if your answer is different.
Probably the same answer. It's
Okay.
probably a grass.
Okay. Someone commented they love the term citizen scientist. So the next question is, there's a free app called Picture It, which purports to identify plants. It's out of China, but marketed to the US. They've been reluctant to install it. So they want to know if you know anything about it, if it's good, or if there is another phone app you would recommend for identifying plants.
Definitely. I've seen that one before, and it doesn't really work that well in my experience. I really recommend actually the app that iNaturalist developed. I sound like I'm working for them. I'm not being paid by them, but they have a phone app as well. That's really cool because it looks at the plant that you are pointing it at, and then it also takes into account all of the observations on iNaturalist that are nearby that look like that plant. So it's using that biogeographical data as well as just trying to match pictures. So I highly recommend. It's called the Seek app, and then from there you can upload that species straight onto iNaturalist.
And that's available for both operating systems.
I think it's I actually don't use it very often. I think it's free, and I think it's on Android, and I'm not sure if it's on Apple.
All right. Another comment. They say your presentation has been fun and your enthusiasm is contagious and makes them want to learn more. And then the next person is interested in the unique features of the mysterious madrona that is so hard to cultivate.
I've wondered that too. Yeah, because it seems like they only grow in pretty close to coastal areas here, but further down in Oregon, they grow really far inland. I've wondered the same thing myself. I don't know. Gardening is not really my specialty.
Another question is, are there species of stinging nettles that do not sting?
Yes. Not in the Pacific Northwest, but that family, the Urticaceae, is pretty common worldwide. And so there's a lot that don't sting, and there's some that sting a lot worse than, believe me, there's some that sting a lot worse than the ones here.
I don't know what this is referring to, so maybe you know the context, but another comment is, I was told it could be O. tortospina as well.
Could you say that one more time?
I was told it could be O. tortospina as well.
I don't think I'm hearing that correctly.
Okay,
I probably would have to read it, maybe. I'm not sure.
okay, yeah, let's, we'll move on to the next one. Which edible wild green plants do you recommend?
Ooh, well, stinging nettles are one of my favorites, if you harvest them early. Also, a lot of the Claytonias here and Montias, if you know what those are, they're called miner's lettuce or spring beauties. I think those taste really good. Those are my favorites. And they're very common, most of them. So, you don't have to worry too much about sustainably harvesting nettles.
All right, we've got one more question here. Someone's asking if you're a fan of the YouTube channel Crime Pays But Botany Doesn't.
Yes, very much. He's full of wisdom and inspires me as well.
Looks like someone has a question about iNaturalist. Can it be used for plants in your yard, or should it only be used for plants in the wild?
I think you can use iNaturalist for whatever purpose you want, and whatever you're getting out of it, that is amazing. Totally, people use it for plants in their yard. They use it for house plants sometimes. But there's a box you can check on there to note that something's not wild and that it's in captivity. And so that just helps people sort that out if they want to do more scientific analyses with the data.
All right, so just a couple more comments, which will put us right up to the end. There is a comment, I believe, from Jade that the Seek app by iNaturalist is available for iPhone. And someone commented that they've read that you need to orient the Madrona you plant in the same direction as it germinated in.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, that's important.
Yeah. All right, so I think that's it. It's right at 4 o'clock. Let's all thank Nolan for his great presentation on our local flora. And a huge thank you to our audience for joining us today. Be sure to check out the Snow Owl website for more information about upcoming programs and the Snow Owl YouTube channel early next week for a recording of this event. Thank you and goodbye.